Johnny Erickson, her accident at age 17, making her a quadriplegic. She wanted to kill herself, but she was too helpless to take her own life. And if God had blessed her with more mobility, she would have taken her life. She says so. Now, who back then said 40 years ago, well, God is clearly working out his loving purpose in this young woman's life for her good? Do you think anyone was standing around saying that? It sure didn't look like it. But consider it today in retrospect. Johnny has touched the world with a depth of character. She is convinced, and those of us who know her and love her, like my wife Nancy and I do, are convinced she would never have had without her disability. And now she has breast cancer. And we look at our sister and we say, Lord, it seems like you're piling it on. And then we look at it and we say, no, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed to us and in us. And Johnny, in just a letter to us, she wrote just the other day, just talking about wanting to be yielded to the Lord and being used of him. She says, I had this ministry to disabled people for so many years. Now I have a ministry to people with cancer. View your afflictions as opportunity for ministry. As Nancy and I look at our lives, I mean, when I look back at, 25 years ago, I became an insulin-dependent diabetic. Okay, so I got this disease. It brings certain complications into my life. But God has used that in my life for good, and I see it even here and now in this life. And go back 20 years ago. I was a pastor for peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience at abortion clinics, all kinds of lawsuits and misrepresentations and false charges and all kinds of things, and had to end up resigning as a pastor. And I loved being a pastor. And there was financial hardships. There was all these kinds of things. At the time, it seemed devastating, but God's hand was upon it. In retrospect, even within a few years, we saw it clearly. And certainly now we look back and see it even more clearly, that God caused that to work for good. What about Genesis 50, verse 20, with Joseph, which is really the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament, if you think about it. He says to his brothers, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good, to save many lives. So by God's grace, Nancy and I have been able to see God do things that there's just not time to tell you, but $5 million of royalties that have gone all over the world, all of that originally coming out of my inability to receive an income and only being able to make minimum wage, otherwise it would be taken by abortion clinics, and just on and on and on. What God did in us, what God did in our children, what God is still doing today. I wouldn't have chosen to become a full-time writer. That wasn't my aspiration. I enjoyed writing. I would write on the side as a pastor. I wanted to stay a pastor, but God didn't want me to stay a pastor. He had better plans, but they involved suffering.